fascinated by what you do. You've been digging in the dirt for decades.
That's right.
In Connecticut. And on this table, we have a lot of things to talk about here. One thing I want to ask you is, how did you become the state's archaeologist? And what exactly does that mean?
What does that mean? What do I do, actually? Well, actually, what happened was after I got out of grad school and graduated with my doctorate from the University of Connecticut in 1987, the legislature was passing a bill to create an Office of State Archaeology. Before that, there was a state archaeologist, but it was mostly an honorary position. But in the mid-'80s, there were a lot of development going on, and it was recognized that the towns were making land use decisions at the local level.
So lots of development was going on.
Lots of development. They needed somebody to help them with cultural and historic resources. So my job was created to basically help municipalities in their land use decisions. So I like to tell people I work with 169 governments.
Well, how fun. And they're all very different.
That's right.
So what makes you want to become an archaeologist? What happens in your childhood, your high school years? What was the deal? That you served some time in the military?
Yeah, it's a long story. I was not a very good student when I was a kid.
And you tell people that.
And I tell people that. I spoke to Farmington High School today, and I told the kids that, I just was immature, and I just did not want to do the work. I just couldn't wait to get out of school. And anyhow, I had no ambitions when I was a kid. I just wanted to get out of school. That's all I ever knew. And what ended up happening was, in the 60s with the Vietnam War going on, sure, I was being drafted. I ended up in the United States Navy for 4 years. I was never in Vietnam, I want to make that clear. My ship was attached to NATO, and we were up in the Arctic Circle in the North Atlantic for 4 years. But when I came out, I was more mature and I wanted to go to school. I knew I had to learn and do something. The problem is nobody would take me because I never took SATs. I had such bad grades. Finally, a community college took a chance on a returning veteran, and basically I had to take probationary, courses to see if I could even do it. And I got into college, and I took an introductory course in anthropology, archaeology, and it was like a light bulb went off, and
the first dig, do you remember the first dig?
Oh, the first dig I did was actually in Waterbury, Connecticut. I was at Central Connecticut State University. We went to, Waterbury was celebrating a major anniversary, and it had to do with the old brass mills. Sure. So they had the Industrial Revolution there. The first site I ever worked was an old industrial water-powered mill in Waterbury.
And do you have those Eureka moments then? You're digging and I found this, and what is that? And I've got to research each little artifact that you find.
I tell my students, don't get Eureka moments, because basically we want to make sure they don't get too excited and lift things out of the ground prematurely. We want to make sure everything gets recorded and mapped, and then it'll be time to celebrate later. But there have been many, I think, and I don't like to emphasize them because archaeology is more of a science, and it's something that, it's a painstaking process. I tell students and people that come up to me, this is work. This is going to be work today. It's not just fun and games, and but it is exciting because you're handling material that people handled thousands of years ago.
What is in the ground in Connecticut, from north, south, east, west? What do we have in our ground, not so far below the surface?
History is beneath your feet. Every day.
That's scaring me a little.
People in Connecticut walk over, drive over, just like the New Haven Green. They walk over that green every day, and not a realization of what's underneath the ground. And you know what? Because it's hidden. It's not like a standing structure where you could see the old house and appreciate villages that have history to it. Archaeological sites are buried, and you have no conscience of them. But beneath our feet is the remnant of Native Americans that have been here for 10,000 years, remnants of colonial sites that have now been buried, and even the burials of people themselves. But plane crashes, shipwrecks, they're all a part of Connecticut's archaeological heritage, which is really fabulous.
So let's talk about some of the things that you brought in. I'm fascinated by this. What is this?
This is called a birdstone. It is actually an Adena artifact. And Adenas were the mound builders in Ohio. And basically what this object was put at the end of a atlatl or a spear
So how
thrower.
would you hold it and tell me how this?
Well, basically they would have had a stick, and this would have been hafted to that stick. You could see the holes at the bottom that allow for the threads to go through, the hafting to go through. And basically this would have been an extension of the arm that would have allowed them to throw the spear in a way that gave it more thrust and more distance. There are guys today that do atlatl contests and they still throw these. Well, these were put on to create a little bit more weight to give more thrust to that spear, but also there's kind of a magical formula here.
And that's
the
bird,
beauty
you
of it,
said.
the bird, and you know, to help and assist in the hunt. The hunt was always precarious, you know. Someday the animals won, some days you won.
Tell me about it.
So, so this kind of helped. It was but beautifully crafted. It's a wonderful piece of
very
artifact.
Smooth. How did they get that
Smooth.
smooth?
You know, grinding and polishing and just creating it's called a banded slate, and it's just one of my favorite objects
How
from
old?
Connecticut. 2,000 years old.
Oh, just 2000.
That's not my, yeah.
Okay,
That's a
what do we
little
have here?
young. That's a little more recent.
It's a fork.
It's
I
a
can
fork.
Tell that.
I thought I'd bring that because it's a good ideal of a colonial era fork that we have here in Connecticut.
1800s.
About, you know, maybe even earlier, maybe late 1700s. And it's a piece of metal. It has a bone actually on both sides
What
as
kind
part
of
of the
bone?
handle. Some kind of mammalian bone. I probably would have been cow or pig
Interesting.
or sheep that they would have had as domestic animals, and then clean the bone, you know, screw it in place,
It's
and
rather
you've got
ornate,
yourself
too.
a little fork.
And it's got a little, you know, it's ornate.
Yeah, it's been
It's not that primitive.
soldered. It's a lot of work going into this, and usually they're rusted. What's nice about this particular object is it's in mint condition. It's a beautiful little fork.
Don't lose that.
But see, the thing archaeologists don't usually excavate are mundane things that everyday things people
Sure.
have.
Like bottles.
Like bottles.
Which,
There's
tell me
a
about the bottle.
Wine bottle dating to about the 1700s, and would have had a cork in here.
Mm-hmm.
And
How did they make this?
they would have blown it in a kiln where they would, you know,
Sure.
the old-fashioned blow the bubble out, blow the pin. They would have dripped onto to make the neck and the area here, and then just fire it in a kiln. And some of them didn't come out so good, some of them busted, but in this case they got a complete bottle, and it worked out well for them.
And you talk about everyday life. You know, we throw things out too, and they're going to find from us from 10,000 years from now what we threw out, such as a jug.
Yeah, it's just as a jug.
Clay?
Absolutely. I tell my students that, you know, it won't be long before we'll be finding iPods.
Yes. Just
in the
wait.
ground,
Yeah, what is
and
that?
trying to figure out what these are. This is a jug. It would have been for fluid of some sort, possibly water or other kind of fluids. It's called a redware, and you can see it's very
clay?
red clay.
Yeah.
That's exactly right. With a nice glaze over it, fired in a similar process that the bottles were fired. And what we find archaeologically, of course, is not the whole pots anymore because they're fragile.
Sure.
But we find what we call shards, you know, just fragments. And of course, our students and workers in our lab put three-dimensional jigsaw puzzles back together to try to reconstruct them when we have them. But this is everyday wear.
This is an axe, you said.
That's an axe,
This
a stone
is
axe.
really heavy.
It's very heavy, yeah.
So this was affixed to a stick?
That's
to
exactly
a,
right.
How did that work?
This
And-
would have
and
been,
what's the year
this
on
is a
that?
Native American artifact. Usually we start seeing these axes coming in about 5,000, 6,000 years ago. They're basically used to fell trees, okay? So this would have been hafted, where you see the groove here,
Sure.
to a stick. What they did is, you know, stone doesn't work very well in raw wood, like a chainsaw or a metal axe. So what they did is they burned the tree. They take a tree, they pack it about waist high with mud, set fire to the base of the tree. As the burns, it turns into charcoal, which is much softer. Then with these axes, on a stick, they would pound it and pound away at the charcoal and literally release it, and eventually they could topple the tree. Strip the branches, strip the bark. Maybe they want to make a dugout canoe. They set fire to the top of it, and then with either axes like this or other groove stones, ground stones, they chisel it out and burn it and chisel until they hollow out the interior of the canoe. put it on the Quinnipiac River. They're down the
They're
road.
pretty darn smart, you know?
I'll tell you, they used what nature gave them, whether it was stone, bone, wood, and it's a remarkable technology what they did.
This is the oldest artifact that you brought with us.
That's right.
Brought with you.
This is called a fluted point. It's basically a spear point. Would have been at the end of a spear. And it's fluted. You could see this channel coming up here. And that's because when they set it into the spear, they tied it right through that. And it was only really the tip that showed. But this is the earliest artifact of the first peopling of Connecticut, about 10, 11,000 years ago. And it makes itself remarkable. We don't have many sites of this time period.
Where was this found?
This was found in Glastonbury, Connecticut.
And was it your Eureka moment that you
It
found
was
it?
actually was found from a collector. It wasn't found from one of our digs who had reported it and brought it in and part of our collection. So we went back to the site, but we never really found any more with it.
Every time that somebody digs in the state of Connecticut and they think they find something, they have to stop. Is that correct?
No, not necessarily. One of the things what I do with the towns is work ahead of construction projects before they start, so that there's no issues once they
But how do you
get
know
it
what's in the
going.
ground before they...
Well, we basically do archaeological surveys. If I have a concern on a property that I think may have an archaeological site associated with it, I'll ask for an archaeological survey. We'll go out and test it and then see what we find. If so, work with the developer to avoid if possible, or remove as a mitigation if necessary. But the only time you must stop is if you hit human remains. Human remains are a special category, and as a result of that, what ends up happening is the police must be called in, medical examiner. It could be part of a modern criminal investigation. If it's not, then I get called in.
Which segues into what we found on the New Haven Green recently around Halloween time. A tree comes down in a big storm, and it unearths what?
It unearthed the possibility of either 2 to 4 individuals, the skeletal remains of two to four individuals. The New Haven Green used to be the town's burying ground, the city's burying ground from the time of Eaton and Davenport right into about the 1790s. Then in 1797, they built Grove Street Cemetery on the other side of Yale, put a big wall around it. They took all the tombstones that were on the green and brought them to Grove Street. They didn't implant them, but if you go to Grove Street Cemetery, you'll see those tombstones around the walls.
Some famous folks.
But they never moved the bodies. They kept them in the ground. And as a result now, when this tree blew over, it exposed at least, again, 2 to 4 burials. There may be hundreds, if not 1,000 people under that green
And
today.
cows and all kinds of things,
I would
right?
bet, yeah. They may have buried a lot of animals as well as,
Because
the
of
cemetery.
illness, they had to have mass graves and things like this.
Well, people
the
were
years.
buried in a good Christian way, east-west orientation, so your head is to the west. The idea is you lay in the grave, you actually are facing the east, and on the day of resurrection, Christ will come up with the sun and remove you from your housing, and you will join in the resurrection. So there's a mortuary practice that's going on, and that's what we saw on the green. They were laying east-west with the head to the west. So they got a good Christian burial, but whether they were marked or not, we don't know.
2 other things I want to hit on. You want to find what in this state? What's the one thing that you want to find? Is that the Mastodon? Is that what you're going after?
Yeah, well, we have 6 archaeological sites, actually paleontological sites, where the fossil remains of mastodons or elephant-like creatures that were once here after the glaciers in Connecticut have been found. But none of them have ever been found with, say, Native American stone tools. We know they're here at about the same time. And we know that elsewhere in Indian North America, stone tools have been found with the fossil bones of these mastodons and mammoths. So I'd love to find one in Connecticut.
So where are you going to seek that out?
Oh,
What
I don't
part of the
know.
state?
It'll only be found through an accidental discovery.
Well, I hope you find it. Also, talk about vampires.
Well, around Halloween too, and basically what happened to me was I was involved in the rescue of a colonial era graveyard, a family burial ground.
Where?
In Griswold, Connecticut. They were sand and gravel mining, a high 50-foot knoll of trucking it out for construction. Stopped work on a Friday. Saturday there's a light rain. Sunday 3 10-year-old boys come to the gravel pit to play, slide down, having a good old time. One slide down, 2 skulls dislodged and tumbled down the hill with the boys. And they freaked right out. But they ran and called their parents. The parents called the police. They came down. The state police roped it off as a crime scene. In fact, one of the early theories that these may have been victims of Michael Ross, a serial killer at that time. But when the medical examiner called me in, we were able to see that the bone was old. It was cortical, it lost, it had some decomposition. and I realized that they hit a farming family graveyard. In rescuing the people off the cliff, archaeologically, we found one individual, instead of being anatomically skeleton laying in the grave, he was rearranged. And what I mean by that, his skull or cranium had been deliberately decapitated and rotated to face the west. His femurs or thigh bones were uprooted from their anatomical position and crossed over their chest. The chest had been broken into, and some of the arms had been rearranged. By the fractures, we could see the signature on the fracture of the bone indicated that it happened probably 3 to 5 years after this guy died. So, this guy dies, given a good Christian burial. 3 to 5 years later, somebody comes in, digs him up, rearranges his bones, and walks away.
What is going on in Connecticut then?
And that's what I was asking. What is this? And what is this all about? And that's when we started to collaborate and found evidence that there was a folk belief that in some cases the dead who died of certain diseases like tuberculosis, for example, remained undead in their graves and were capable of leaving the housing in that grave and feed on living family members and hence spread the disease. This was before germ theory. People had no idea how diseases were spread. Tuberculosis was a pulmonary distress.
Sure.
You had tubercular victims in farming families sitting with large families coughing and coughing. Nobody's covering their mouth. They had no clue.
So they killed you a second time, basically.
They really, it was epidemic. And everybody was, and so they thought when the doctors couldn't help them, the churches couldn't help them, that maybe it was the dead who were mischievous now and coming back and feeding on the people. So they went into the graves, rearranged them, burned hearts if they were still there, and basically put them to rest. It was not what we think about it as vampirism, but what it was a public health issue. People were dying. Family members were dying. These people were frightened.
People were frightened.
They had no way to stop the deaths. Maybe, just maybe, this was an answer. And they were desperate. And it was worth a try.
A couple more things I'm going to ask you. I could talk to you for hours. But let's address the Adolf Hitler.
Yes.
What happened? How did you get called into this case?
Well, I had done a couple of programs for the History Channel a few years back, and so their producers had always kept me kind of online saying, every now and then they had an idea for a program. They'd send me an email and say, Nick, what do you think about this? What can we do? So they sent me an email saying, we're thinking of doing a program on the death and ultimate remains of Adolf Hitler, possibility going to Russia, looking at a skull
And your ears
cap.
went, okay.
No, actually not.
Really?
So I sent them back some advice, what they could do forensically, what they could do in the ground. And then they came back to me and said, this is great. Would you be our scientist for the program? And I said, I'm not a historian on World War II. I've never excavated in Europe. I said, you need somebody from that area. So anyhow, that night I went home and I told my wife, I said, History Channel wanted me to go to Europe to do a program on Hitler. And she said, when are you leaving? And I said, are you trying to get rid of me? But she kind of said, you really need to do this.
So the skull they found was not his?
No, and the program wasn't very clear on that. Basically, the skull itself was found a year after the Russians had entered Berlin they entered Berlin in May of 1945. They recovered the skull in May of 1946. A year later, it was out of context, but they found it in the area that they found Hitler's original body. So they made an assumption that this was Hitler, and they brought it to Moscow, and it turned out it wasn't. It was actually a woman.
Well, there you go. Not quite Adolf Hitler.
Different.
And then let's just sum up with the Jimmy Hoffa case.
Jimmy Hoffa. Well, we'll never find him.
Where is he?
I have no idea, and they'll never find him.
How did you get involved in that?
I really didn't do any major work on the Jimmy Hoffa case. Every now and then the FBI gets some ideas, information that he may be buried. Most recently, I think they were on a farm in Michigan or someplace looking out there. And so the idea is that maybe he's still in the ground out there, but I suspect we'll never, ever find the remains of Jimmy Hoffa. But I would sure like to be involved if it happens.
Well, see, there you go. So when are you leaving?
That's right. As soon as I get the call.
In summation, somebody who wants to be an archaeologist, what do you need to know? What kind of passions do you have to have?
Well, it's like I said, it is.
And here's the website too. We need to point out Connecticut State Museum of Natural History and Archaeology. If you don't know about it, find out about it.
It's
on
where
the
we're
Source
located,
campus.
and it's a wonderful little museum, an archaeology center that does, we're a small staff, they do a great job, and that's where my office is housed administratively. You know, I tell students two things. If you really want to be an archaeologist, first thing to do, get some field experience. And there's an Archaeological Society of Connecticut. I have a friends group, the Friends of the Office of State Archaeology, that provides learning and for people an opportunity to get out. Lay people want to come out and excavate, they have that opportunity through our office
that's
and
great.
through our friends group. And we give them the experience. And I tell them, get in the field, because the field will make or break you. Because the field is not easy. And if they can get through a week or a day, and at the end of the day, they say, yeah, you'll know. You'll know if this is what you want to do for the rest of your life, or you'll say, I'll never do this again. But get in the field and do it. The other thing is take a broad range of sciences, because you'll use everything from the biological sciences, the earth sciences, the social sciences. We use it all. I like to think archaeologists are the last of the Renaissance people. We have our own specialization, but we need to know so much and of so many different areas in science and history. And we collaborate. We collaborate with other scientists. And that's, to me, the most fun of my work is not just what I do, but collaborating with other scientists.
Well, Dr. Bellantoni, thanks for coming on. I really appreciate it. And
Thank
I
you
can
for
hear the
having me.
passion in your voice. Thanks.
Thank you.